Hello everybody, today I'm going to be covering the 3 games that made Magnus Carlsen the world chess champion that he is today. I'm doing a Q&A soon, so leave your chess questions in the comments. Let's get on with it. Alright, let me set the scene. The year is 2013 and Viswanathan Anand is the current chess world champion. Magnus Carlsen has just won the 2013 Candidates Tournament with a rating of 2,872. He's 22 years old at the minute and has already built up quite a name for himself in the chess community. This championship is in a 12-game format of classical chess. This is round 5. On 2 now, it's been all draws. Because this video is about Magnus, we'll be reviewing all of these games from his perspective, and he starts out with the move c4, the English opening, also known as the reverse Sicilian defense. Vishy responds with e6. I think this is a very comprehensive response, because if d4, then this is transposed to a sort of Nimzo-Indian or Queen's Indian defense. If knight f3, then b6 is certainly a choice, and then if knight c3, then we will get this bishop pin. And this does happen. Magnus follows with d4, but instead of this knight f6 plan, we have the move d5. Immediately going into the Queen's Gambit declined. We have knight c3, c6. This is the semi-Slav defense accelerated move order. This sort of triangle structure here is very solid for black, although Black might have some problem developing this light squared bishop over here due to the light squared pawn structure. Magnus plays the move e4 here, and this is the Marshall Gambit. There's 2 Marshall Gambits. There's one in this position and there's one in the Roy Lopez. It's quite easy to get them confused, but the Marshall Gambit is crazy. D takes e4 is played, knight takes e4, bishop b4 check, and knight c3. Just to show you how interesting the Marshall Gambit is. Bishop d2, the main line of the gambit, after which queen takes d4. For example, this is one of the lines. If knight e2 to block this check, then black does actually equalise, but in a very interesting way. After knight a6, bishop f8 is played, attacking this g7 pawn, and if king takes, then the queen comes all the way to d8 and it is a checkmate. After bishop f8, the correct move is knight e7, and then we'd have bishop takes g7, rook g8, and bishop c3. This is a crazy position, and white has a small advantage, but I definitely consider this position easy to draw for the black pieces. If instead of blocking the check with knight e2, bishop e2 is played, queen takes g2, this is one of the main lines, bishop f3, queen g6, and knight e2, white has quite a substantial advantage of plus 1.3 pawns, and black will find it quite hard to castle kingside with this bishop over here. But instead of going into any of that, after bishop b4 check, we do have knight c3, and then this is a quite equal position. With the move c5, although beginners are told not to move the same piece twice in an opening, this is with good reason, really chipping away at the white centre. We have a3 kicking out the bishop, bishop a5, the bishop comes back, still keeping pressure on this knight, knight f3, knight f6, and bishop e3. The bishop develops and supports the centre over here, knight c6, queen d3, Queen d3 is a very nice central square for the queen, maybe preparing to castle queenside in the future. C takes d4, knight takes d4, and then plays the move knight g4 going after this bishop on e3, but Magnus ignores it. Queenside castles, knight takes e3, and f takes e3. And this is a very interesting position. So here, black has the bishop pair, although this light squared bishop is not very active. White now has the open f-file, which would be useful in attack, but also quite a scattered pawn structure. The move bishop c7 was played, rerouting to a more useful diagonal. I suppose that here on a5, when the king is no longer on e1, the bishop serves no real purpose on a5 at that moment, so that's why it's brought back to c7. It also controls some of these important dark squares over here. Knight takes c6 is played, b takes c6, and we have a queen trade. Queen takes d8, b takes d8. And now you may wonder how Magnus Carlsen is going to try and convert this position, especially with black still having the bishop pair. We have seen Magnus convert these positions many a time, but it never gets sold. First off, bishop e2. Simply developing the king e7. King e7 is an interesting move. Anand opts not to castle and instead brings the king straight forward. The bishops will move out of the way and then the rooks will connect. Bishop f3. Rerouting this bishop again to harass this weak c6 pawn. Of course, the c6 pawn cannot move forward just yet as it is pinned to the rook on a8. Bishop d7 is played, defending this pawn. Magnus plays the move knight e4, which sets up quite a nasty threat of knight c5, where this bishop will be attacked by the knight and the rook, forced off, and then the c6 pawn will be lost. If black allows knight c5, then they'll be in very deep trouble. And this is where I find it fascinating how grandmasters find solutions to these problems. So bishop e6 is played, guarding knight c5 and provoking the move c5, which is the best move. But now the pawn is on c5, this knight cannot come here anymore, Anand doesn't have to worry about this threat. But now Magnus has got this nice d6 outpost, and it is important here for black not to give up any ground and retreat. If Anand were to retreat here, it hands all the power to Magnus. Knight d6, bishop takes d6, and rook takes d6, planning to double up on the d file, exerting a lot of pressure, especially on this c6 pawn over here. I mean, you're already in an endgame with Magnus Carlsen, which isn't the best situation, but allowing this would be too much. So instead of this, Viswanathan Anand finds a very creative solution to this problem and plays the move f5, danger levels at the highest level. C takes b6 is played, f takes e4, and instead of immediately recapturing with this bishop, Magnus plays quite an interesting b7. This is an in-between move or an intermezzo, just attacking the rook. And I think the idea is that after rook a b8, bishop takes e4, rook takes b7, this is a very small nuance in the position, but I think it's really important and just shows how articulate Magnus is in these games. So if instead of b7 and white were to immediately recapture, then black takes, opens the a file for this rook over here, and now these two pawns are connected, which is a lot safer for the both of them, rather in the game situation. After rook takes b7, this rook is on a lot less active of a square. This pawn is still pinned against the rook, and these pawns are isolated and be easy to pick off later on. So I believe that this just shows the skill that is involved at playing at this level. Rook hf1 is played, and now rook b5. Rook b5 is an attempt to unpin this c6 pawn, and also get this rook to this somewhat active 5th rank square. Rook f4 is played, Magnus does the same, maybe going to come over here and attack these weak pawns, but more importantly probably to double on the f file where we can exert a lot of pressure on the black king. G5 is played. By the way, this position, the engine says 0, 0, 0, completely drawn. But I think Magnus's technique is to make it easy for the opponent to make a mistake, as you'll see later. Rook f3 is played, just stepping back one little space. H5 is played. So Anand is using these pawns to grab some space on the king side, so they'll be a little bit safer, but it could be considered overextending. The position is still 0-0. Rook df1, bishop e8, a bit of rerouting now, bishop c2. And you see here, I try my best to explain what's going on in games, but I honestly have no idea why bishop c2 was played. My only idea is that it makes room for e4 and maybe stops this rook from coming and giving a check over here. This bishop e8 move makes sense as it protects this f7 infiltration square. So here we have rook c5, pinning this bishop now, rook f6, so this rook comes to the only infiltration square that isn't currently defended. H4 this is still a 0-0 position, although this could be considered slightly overextended. I'm sure that the engine is just having a bit of a hiccup here, but it gives white the slightest advantage. I'm talking 0.1. E4 is played, so white finally grabs a bit more space in the center. A5, king d2, the kings are very important in endgame, so getting as active as possible is always a good idea. Also unpinning from this rook's effect on the c file. Rook b5 is played, attacking this weak b2 pawn as the king has strayed from the c1 square which defends this pawn. B3, this is a sensible move, moving it one square forward where the bishop now defends it. Bishop h5, this diagonal is quite good for the bishop where it takes away some squares from the white king, but also still defends this f7 infiltration square. King c3 is played, maybe planning to move to c4 where it will control more space, but I think more importantly allowing this bishop to move as this king now manages the role of defending the b3 pawn. Rook c5 check, this is reasonable. King b2, so the king's done a little walk here, and it's easy to ask yourself what this accomplishes, but it's just trying to squeeze a stone for Magnus's position here. Just trying to make the slightest of improvements that eventually build up to a somewhat tangible advantage. And what I find about Magnus's games is that he leaves the opponent in a sort of zugzwang where the opponent isn't sure what move to make. They think that it doesn't really matter. They sign it off as a drawn position, and then suddenly Magnus has the advantage. Rook 1 f2. So just managing this d2 infiltration square, and this bishop manages the other infiltration squares, which is quite useful. Rook d4, this rook comes to the 4th rank and exerts a somewhat measurable amount of pressure, but this is what I was on about. This position has been 0-0-0 for probably around 15-20 moves. I'm not really sure. This is move 34 at the minute. And now white, according to the engine, has a 0.4 advantage. Rook h6 is played, attacking this bishop, trying to force it off of this quite useful diagonal. Bishop d1, Anand offers a bishop trade and Magnus declines with bishop b1. It's quite interesting because I do believe that the white bishop, although it does seem somewhat blocked in, it provides quite a nice defensive role in the position. But one thing to mention is that after bishop b1, it seems like Magnus could be in trouble with the defense of this b3 pawn. Anyway, we have rook b5, king c3, the king steps forward and attacks this rook, just sort of harassing it, c5, and rook b2. This rook comes, no worries about this defense of this pawn now. e5, and Magnus has a wonderful position. It's a very solid position, everything's defended. White's rook over here can exert a lot of pressure on these pawns. In Anand's effort to sort of advance forward, he's sort of blocked himself in, especially with this bishop over here. It won't really find itself any useful squares on this diagonal anymore. Rook g6 is played, attacking this weak pawn. a4. Anand goes for some counterplay on the queen queenside, but Magnus simply ignores it with rook takes g5. Rook takes b3 check, rook takes b3, bishop takes b3, rook takes e5 check. So Magnus has calculated that at the end of this variation, he will be winning a pawn. King d6, rook h5. According to the engine, this position is still perfectly holdable for Anand though. Rook d1, attacking the bishop. We have e5 check, king d5, now bishop h7. The bishop comes all the way over here and threatens to reroute and somewhat skewer this king to this bishop over here. And now rook c1. This was the turning point of the game. The engine classifies this as a mistake and it prefers for rook a1. I'll show you the line now. So bishop g8 is recommended. All of this happens, and here it's very important not to immediately take this bishop but play rook takes a3, which is a beautiful idea. This bishop is pinned to the king by this rook, and for example, if rook takes h4, rook takes, the king moves, and I believe that this passed pawn on the outside will create enough counterplay. This position is completely drawn, but instead of that, Anand plays the move rook c1. This gives a 1+ advantage for black, and Magnus plays the correct move, king b2, rook g1, bishop g8, and now we see this power of this skewer over here, king c6. Although Magnus can immediately take this bishop and win, he plays the intermezzo move, rook h6 check, king d7, and now it's just about converting. Bishop takes b3, a takes b3, king takes b3. Magnus is 2 pawns up, and then regains one with rook takes g2, but now rook takes h4. This is a clean 2 pawns up. Just keep on going through the moves here, and these passed pawns are just going to prove too much for black to defend. The black rook on a2 does manage this pawn, but after king c5, h4, and then knows what's coming next. This white king does a very good job of controlling this c pawn, and this pawn's just going to march up. The rook can't deal with 2 threats at the same time. So a beautiful conversion of the position by Magnus Carlsen. Let me just bring it back to the queen trade here. It seems impossible for white to win this position, especially with black having the bishop pair, but it all came down just to pressure, just this being solid and sort of letting the opponent advance forward and then punishing them. Really beautiful game. Let's move on to round 9. Round 9 is a little shorter, thank goodness. I was losing my voice. And Magnus has the black pieces in this one, and at the minute he has a 2 point. So Anand opens with d4, we have knight f6. This is a very principled response, c4 and e6. So where I prefer g6 with the Grunfeld setups, Magnus goes for e6. So this is inviting the Nimzo Indian after knight c3 and bishop b4. In this position, Anand plays f3, which is a very challenging move to face as a Nimzo player. Personally, I've played the Nimzo up until around the 2000 level, and I always struggled with this. I found that white got a very strong attack, and you have to be very precise with the black pieces to defend, but this is the highest level, so let's see what happens. d5 is played, a3. It wouldn't be very smart for the bishop to retreat. White would probably just get too much space, so bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and this is the position. Black is going to try and prove that even though white is a massive centre and has the bishop pair, that these pawns are weak. This is the entire idea of this setup. So c5, immediately striking back at the white centre. C takes d5, white now gets rid of these doubled c pawns. E takes d5 and e3. c4, this is very interesting. This is a move that I would never thought of playing when I was playing the Nimzo, as I would believe that after e4, white simply has too much activity. For example, takes, bishop takes. I would not be comfortable playing this position, although it might be okay. I'll see what the engine thinks actually. So e4, actually the incorrect move because takes of bishop takes and just castles. So yeah, I suppose this is okay. This position is somewhat equal, which I didn't know. I'll have to go back to playing the Nimzo. I'll certainly do an opening video on it. Anyway, c4, and instead of any of that, I'll turn the engine off. We have knight e2. The knight is quite good on this square, and it might reroute to g3 in the future, where we can control some important kingside attacking squares. Knight c6 and g4, so immediately Anand is going for the quick attack. And castles, Magnus Carlsen castles. I would never play any of this. Magnus Carlsen castles on the king side when g4 has just been played. This is going to be very interesting. So at the minute, white has this massive queenside attack, and I see that the only real advantage black has is this sort of central control and possibly the b3 square that I haven't noticed until now. Bishop g2, so Fian Chetwynd acting like g4, never played. Maybe it's just an improved g3 for Fian Chetwynd. Knight a5, so now coming to this b3 square and kingside castles. It's a crazy game. I don't really know what to say about it. Knight b3, so the knight hops in and attacks the rook, rook a2. But this could be quite an advantage for the white pieces. This rook can swing over and start a deadly attack quite quickly. b5, both sides pushing these pawns. Knight g3, so this knight now just come to g3, behind the support of this g4 pawn, and it could advance in the future. a5, g5, This pawn now advances, kicking out the knight. The knight returns to the e8 square, which is a very sensible decision where it defends g7, and also this queen now threatens to capture this pawn. But now we finally have e4, this expansion in the center, and now this bishop defends this pawn. Knight takes c1, this dark squared bishop is captured. Although this knight is very strong on b3 and controls a lot of space, and you'd normally say not to just trade it off for a bishop over here, this bishop could cause a lot of problems for black in terms of an attack. So knight takes c1, queen takes c1. This is the safe option for Magnus to go for, but this is still a crazy position. Rook a6. The rook comes to the 6th rank, stopping any sort of real progress for the white pieces on the king side. e5 played, locking down the center. But if your opponent is playing on the center, then you should play on the flanks. And if your opponent's playing on the flanks, you should play in the center. So this is what we're going to see now. Knight c7, f4. Trying to start a kingside attack, and b4. This is a very important break in trying to equalize for the black pieces. A takes b4, a takes b4. Rook takes a6, knight takes a6. f5. White is building a very dangerous attack here. The engine rates this position as a slight advantage for white, but I believe that if you give this position to any players under 2,500, white will win 90% of the time, just with this attack coming in all this space on the king side. But Magnus finds a way. b3. Pushing on the queen side. This is a passed pawn, don't forget, and it's 2 squares away from promotion as well. Queen f4, desperately trying to start an attack. Knight c7, the knight reroutes. I believe that the idea behind this move is that maybe if f6 is ever played, then g6, and then the knight can come here, or maybe the knight could come to b5 and attack these weak pawns over here. f6. So this is what we see. g6, queen h4. It looks like Anand is starting a deadly attack. But knight e8, the knight comes back, guards this g7 square, the queen comes to h6, b2, and Anand plays an amazing move with rook f4, allowing this pawn to promote, but the threat of rook h4 seems unstoppable. b1 equals queen, and Anand plays the move knight f1, which was a mistake. The move that Anand should have played was bishop f1, but it's extremely hard to see the difference between the two. With bishop f1, after the move queen d1, I'll run through the engine line. The rook comes here threatening mate, and the queen that is just promoted over here sacrifices itself. Knight takes, pawn takes, rook takes, and the bishop comes out here and defends the mate. This is a playable position, it's completely drawn. Black does have a knight for 2 pawns, but Anand should be able to hold this position. The engine in fact recommends sacrificing the exchange, and then the bishop drops back. This is very interesting. But instead of the correct move, which was bishop f1, white plays knight f1. But now, it's a -8 advantage for black, because after the queen comes to e1, if rook h4 is played with the same idea, now black can sacrifice the queen for the rook rather than for the knight. And in this position, black has a rook for a pawn. So it was in the position after queen e1, I believe, that Anand resigned the game, realising his mistake. This was very unfortunate, but still a really beautifully formed game. And rook f4 was a great idea. It was just the case of which piece blocks this check. This now puts Magnus in a 3-point lead on round 9 of the championship. Remember, there's 12 games. Let's now have a look at round 10. When I was editing this video, I realised that my microphone was muted for my entire game analysis of round 10. So I'm gonna do it again, and I think that my microphone's working this time. So anyway, in this game, Magnus has the white pieces and Anand has the black pieces. As I mentioned earlier, Anand needs to win the next 3 games to equalise Magnus's 3-point lead. And in this game, Magnus with the white pieces, Anand with the black pieces, e4 and c5. I think this is a great choice for Anand due to the fact that the Sicilian is one of the most counter-attacking defences. It's very wild and offers him probably the best winning chances. We have knight f3, the open variation, d6 and bishop b5. This is just brutal. Magnus goes for the Moscow Sicilian, which is personally I feel one of the most drawish lines that white can play against the Sicilian. Knight d7, d4 expanding in the centre, c takes d4, queen takes d4, a6, kicking the bishop out. Bishop takes d7, bishop takes d7 and c4. This structure here is called the Maboxy bind, and Magnus isn't playing around. He's just going to try and suffocate the black pieces and then get the draw. Knight f6 is played by Anand, trying his best to make something happen in the position. Bishop g5, e6, knight c3, and all of these pieces partake in the role of just stopping d5, which is one of black's major breaks in the Sicilian. Bishop e7, castles, bishop c6, queen d3 and castles. And now knight d4. Magnus steps his queen back to bring the knight here and harass this bishop. Rook c8, Magnus doesn't even capture the bishop, instead opting for b3, just really solidifying the structure, making sure this c4 pawn's going nowhere, and neither is this e4 pawn, just preventing d5. Queen c7, knight takes c6, Magnus finally accepts this bishop. Queen takes c6, rook a c1, h6, bishop e3. The bishop comes back to this diagonal, it's quite nice here. And now h3. I suppose this move gives Magnus's king a little bit of loft. but maybe also prevents the knight from coming here in the future. Queen c7 plays, stepping back. Anand seems to be playing quite a few waiting moves and not really making so much progress in the position, which is what Magnus wants. Rook fd1, queen a5, queen d2. The queen steps back and Magnus is threatening knight d5. Let me show you a second. For instance, if let's just say rook b8, then this knight hops forward, the queens see each other. For example, if takes, and we have the intermezzo in between move, knight takes e7 check, the king comes across, rook takes, king takes, Magnus wins a pawn hit. This would be great. So after queen d2, king f8 is played, so that knight takes e7 would not come with a check. Queen b2 and king g8, and weirdly seems to be offering the repetition here, as after queen d2 and if king f8 was played again, it would end in a draw by threefold repetition. But instead of this, Magnus goes for the move a4, really tying down on the black queen side. Queen h5, Anand swings his queen all the way over here, perhaps not wanting to get in the way of some sort of queen side expansion by the white pieces. Knight e2, this is quite a versatile square for the knight. It could come here and attack the queen, but most importantly it opens up this diagonal, and Magnus is now threatened bishop takes g7. To respond to this, Anand plays a move bishop f6, we have rook c3, the rook's coming to the third rank where it could be quite useful and maybe trying to start an attack. Bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, Magnus has successfully traded off one pair of pieces. Queen e5, queen d2 now, lining up against this weak d6 pawn. The reason this pawn is so weak is just because this Maroczy bound structure, preventing the weakness from being dissolved with the move d5, striking in the centre. Knight f6 played, attacking the e4 pawn. And now rook e3 defending. Rook d7 and a5 renders this b7 pawn a backwards pawn where it could be a future weakness, and also just gains even more space on the queen side. Magnus is trying to suffocate Anand here. Queen g5 and the beautiful move e5. And if I just turn on the engine here, this is a plus 3.3 position. Of course, this pawn cannot be captured due to rook takes d7, so Anand comes back with a move knight e8 defending this pawn. But there is 1, 2, 3 attackers of the d6 square and 1, 2 defenders, so that means that white can take. E takes d6, rook c6, the move f4 attacking the queen. Black's queen is quite short on square, so retreats all the way back to d8. There is now 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers of this d6 pawn. There's no real way for Magnus to defend it, but with the move rook e d3 can certainly force some more trades. Rook c takes d6, rook takes d6, rook takes d6, and in this position a queen trade is inevitable, as if knight takes d6 is played, then c5. This knight cannot move anywhere and still defend the queen. White would win a piece here. So instead, after rook takes d6, queen takes d6, we have a queen trade here, and now all Magnus has to do is draw this drawn knight endgame. So I'll just run through the moves quickly now. King f2, king f8. I think that Magnus does try to create some chances in this position, because sometimes if you try to draw, then you will end up being overrun. It's always good to try and put some pressure on your opponent so you don't get overwhelmed. King e3, king e7, the kings have a little walk around the board, going over to the queen side, knight c3, knight f5, nice to a little dance as well, f5 attacking the knight, knight d6 and g5, so Anand's trying to create a small amount of counterplay here, maybe create a passed f pawn, but Magnus won't allow this. Knight e8 check, this is a nice reroute, king d7, knight f6 check, king e7, knight g8 check. This knight has gone on a little bit of a journey here, and it's with a fork of the king and the h6 pawn. King f8, knight takes h6, g takes f4, g takes f4, and now with Magnus being up a pawn, this is very unlikely to be winnable, but Magnus does now have the control over the position. King g7, knight takes f5, this is a very nice knight sacrifice, a knight for 2 pawns, which will be sufficient material to hold the draw, especially after e takes f5, the king comes to b6, there's no real way to defend these queenside pawns. Knight g2, king takes b7, knight takes f4, king takes a6, knight e6, king b6, the king is making room for this a pawn to come through, f4, a6, f3, a7, f2, a8 queen, f1 queen. This position could get a little dicey here with the open kings on b6 and g7, but this is the highest level, they'll know how to defend all those threats. Queen d5, queen e1, queen d6, queen e3 check, king a6, and I now plays the only suitable check in this position, knight c5 check, king b5, knight takes b3, queen c7 check, and this is a pure draw, king h6, queen b6 check. This forces off the queens, queen takes b6, king takes b6, king h5, h4, king takes h4, c5, and now this is completely drawn. Knight takes c5, and now captures this pawn. This is a draw immediately by insufficient material, but I'll just put this position on the... Oh no, I can't, the game's ended. Oh well, so there we are. Since it's a draw, Anand did not get the 3 wins that he needed to equalise with Magnus, and there we are, the 2013 World Championship. Those are the best games that I've handpicked out of it. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I'll switch up the video placements this time, so the most recent video is actually going to be here this time, and the one that YouTube thinks you'll like is right here. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.